History often teaches slavery through numbers: ships crossed, crops harvested, empires enriched. But numbers alone cannot explain what enslaved black women endured. Their oppression was unique, layered, and relentless. It fused forced labor with systematic sexual coercion, erased consent, and stripped away all control over their own bodies. This was not incidental cruelty. It was built into the system itself. Imagine waking each day knowing your labor did not belong to you, nor did your body, your future, or even your children. Enslaved black women were expected to work from dawn until nightfall. Yet they were also vulnerable to violations that were never recorded as crimes. The law did not protect them. Society did not believe them. History often chose not to remember them. This story is not about isolated acts by a few individuals. It is about a structure that rewarded silence, normalized abuse, and passed trauma from one generation to the next. From plantations to households, from youth to motherhood, enslaved women lived under constant surveillance and fear, while being blamed for the very harms inflicted upon them. And yet, despite this crushing reality, their experiences were buried, softened by myths, erased by ours, and ignored by mainstream history. What remains are fragments, births without acknowledged fathers, families torn apart, and legacies that still shape our world today. In this video, we confront that hidden history, not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. Because you cannot fully understand slavery or its lasting consequences without listening to the voices of black women who were never allowed to speak. If you believe history should tell the whole truth, support this channel by liking this video, sharing it with others, and subscribing for more stories that challenge silence and restore forgotten voices. To sustain a system as brutal as slavery, violence alone was never enough. It required an ideology, one powerful enough to silence victims, absolve perpetrators, and make cruelty appear natural. For enslaved black women, that ideology took the form of a dangerous myth. The claim that they were inherently promiscuous, morally loose, and driven by uncontrollable desire. This belief did not emerge by accident. It was carefully constructed, repeated, and enforced because it served the interests of those in power. Within the colonial world, European society measured virtue through race. White womanhood was idealized as pure, delicate, and in need of protection, while black womanhood was cast as its opposite. Enslaved women were portrayed as physical rather than emotional beings, closer to instinct than intellect, and therefore unworthy of the moral consideration granted to others. Once this image took hold, it reshaped how their suffering was perceived. If a woman was believed to desire what was done to her, then harm could be rebranded as inevitability, and exploitation could be dismissed as nature taking its course. This myth became a convenient shield for slave owners, overseers, and colonial authorities. It allowed acts of sexual coercion to be excluded from legal definitions of wrongdoing, because the law itself was written to recognize enslaved people as property rather than persons. Courts could not acknowledge violations against bodies that the system refused to recognize as autonomous. In this framework, the absence of consent was irrelevant, because consent was never expected to exist. Silence, fear, and survival were later misread as willingness, reinforcing the lie and strengthening the structure that depended on it. Over time, this distorted narrative seeped into every corner of colonial life. It influenced how enslaved women were spoken about in travel accounts, plantation records, and religious commentary. It shaped the way white families rationalized the presence of mixed-race children within their households, allowing society to look away while maintaining a facade of order and morality. Even when pregnancies made exploitation visible, the myth ensured that blame never followed power. Instead, responsibility was quietly shifted onto those with the least ability to defend themselves. The tragedy of this myth lies not only in the harm it enabled, but in how thoroughly it erased the inner lives of enslaved women. Their fear, resistance, grief, and endurance were flattened into caricature. Survival strategies were misinterpreted as character flaws, and moments of forced proximity were later reframed as evidence of choice. History inherited these distortions, repeating them in language that sounded neutral but carried the weight of centuries of injustice. What connects this myth to the broader story of enslaved black women is its role in denying their humanity. Earlier, we confronted how their labor and bodies were controlled through force. This ideology ensured that even when violence occurred without witnesses, it could be dismissed without consequence. It transformed suffering into something unremarkable and made empathy conditional on race. In doing, it helped slavery persist not just as an economic system, but as a cultural reality that taught entire societies who deserved protection and who did not. Understanding this myth is essential because it did not vanish with emancipation. Its echoes continued to shape laws, media portrayals, and social attitudes long after slavery formally ended. The image of black women as inherently available or undeserving of sympathy did not remain confined to the past. It evolved, adapted, and survived. By tracing its origins within slavery, we begin to see how deeply embedded it became, and why confronting it is necessary to fully understand both history and its lasting consequences. The system that stripped enslaved black women of control over their bodies did not begin on the plantation, nor did it end there. It followed them across oceans, borders, and stages of life, unfolding wherever power went unquestioned. From the moment of capture to the final years of bondage, vulnerability was constant, and protection was absent. What united these spaces was not geography, but authority held almost exclusively by white men, and enforced through silence and fear. The journey across the Atlantic marked the first chapter of this experience. Aboard slave ships, women were confined in conditions designed for control rather than survival. Proximity to officers' quarters, constant surveillance, and forced exposure created an environment where personal boundaries dissolved. The routines imposed on enslaved women during the voyage: daily inspections, compulsory movement, and public visibility were not neutral practices. They reinforced dominance and made resistance nearly impossible. In these floating worlds, distance from law and land meant that power operated without restraint, and abuses left no records beyond their consequences. Upon arrival, the violence did not disappear. It simply changed form. On plantations, exploitation became part of daily life, woven into labor schedules and household arrangements. Enslaved women worked in fields, kitchens, and nurseries, often moving between public and private spaces that offered no refuge. In households especially, closeness was framed as trust, yet it often intensified vulnerability. The same proximity that placed women near families also placed them beyond the reach of witnesses, where authority could be exercised without accountability. What appeared outwardly as domestic order frequently concealed quiet suffering. Power functioned through routine rather than spectacle. There were no formal declarations, no written permissions. Instead, control was maintained through expectation. Enslaved women learned that refusal carried consequences, while endurance became a means of survival. These patterns rarely entered official records, not because they were rare, but because they were normalized. Silence protected reputations, preserved social hierarchies, and ensured that responsibility remained diffuse and unchallenged. Even motherhood did not shield women from this reality. Pregnancy altered workloads but not authority. Enslaved mothers continued to labor while navigating constant uncertainty about their children's futures. The presence of new life did not interrupt exploitation. It often deepened it, binding women more tightly to systems that viewed both them and their children as assets. This continuity reveals the true nature of unchecked power. It adapts rather than retreats. By the time emancipation approached, generations had lived under these conditions, absorbing trauma that was rarely acknowledged and never repaired. The story of sexual abuse within slavery is not a sequence of isolated moments, but a continuous thread that connected ship holds to plantation fields and public labor to private spaces. Understanding this continuity forces us to confront slavery as a lived experience rather than an abstract institution. When we place this reality alongside the myths that justified exploitation and the silence that preserved it, a clearer picture emerges. The abuse endured by enslaved black women was not incidental, nor confined to a single setting. It was sustained by a system that allowed power to operate without limits, shaping lives in ways that history is only beginning to fully reckon with. When individual stories are placed side by side, a pattern begins to emerge, one that challenges the idea that abuse within slavery was rare or accidental. The lives of women like Sally Hemings, alongside countless enslaved women in the French Atlantic world, expose something far more unsettling. Their experiences reveal that sexual exploitation was not the result of personal moral failure or isolated cruelty, but a predictable outcome of a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of a few and deny protection to the many. Sally Hemings lived within the walls of Monticello, a place often celebrated as a symbol of enlightenment and freedom. Yet behind that image was a reality shaped by ownership and inequality. Hemings was legally enslaved from birth, bound to a household where her labor, movement, and future were controlled. The children she bore to Thomas Jefferson were not recognized as evidence of wrongdoing under the law of the time, because the law itself refused to acknowledge the possibility that an enslaved woman could withhold consent. What appears centuries later as a personal relationship cannot be separated from the structure that made refusal impossible. Her story endures not because it was unusual, but because it was so revealing. Across the Atlantic, in French colonies and trading outposts, similar dynamics unfolded under different flags and languages. Enslaved women transported through the French Atlantic world lived under legal codes that explicitly defined them as property. In port towns and island communities, women worked as domestic servants, laborers, and caregivers, often within close proximity to their owners' families. This closeness did not imply safety. Instead, it intensified exposure to authority exercised behind closed doors, where reputation mattered more than justice. Parish records quietly noted births while omitting fathers' names, leaving historians to read between the lines of what was left unsaid. These cases, separated by geography, share a common foundation. The absence of legal recognition for enslaved women's autonomy meant that exploitation required no justification. Power did not need to announce itself. It simply operated. The system ensured that consequences never flowered upward. Children born into bondage inherited their mother's status, reinforcing the cycle and turning exploitation into a mechanism for sustaining slavery itself. What might appear as private behavior was, in reality, deeply political, reinforcing economic and racial hierarchies with every generation. What makes these stories especially revealing is not only what they show, but what they conceal. Records are fragmented, selective, and shaped by those who held authority. Yet even within that silence, patterns persist. The repetition of similar outcomes across colonies and empires demonstrates that these were not deviations from the norm. They were expressions of it. Enslaved women were positioned at the intersection of race, gender, and power, where vulnerability was constant and recourse non-existent. By connecting these histories, the illusion of exception falls away. Sally Hemings was not alone, nor were the women of the French Atlantic world anomalies. They were part of a broader reality in which exploitation was sustained by law, culture, and economic interest. The system functioned precisely as intended, protecting those at the top while rendering the suffering of others invisible. Understanding these cases forces a shift in perspective. Slavery cannot be fully understood through labor statistics or political debates alone. It must also be examined through the intimate spaces where power was exercised daily and without restraint. These stories do not merely add detail to history. They redefine it. They remind us that what endured for centuries did so not because it was hidden, but because it was embedded so deeply that it came to be seen as ordinary. Motherhood, for enslaved black women, existed within a reality shaped by fear rather than protection. It unfolded under constant surveillance, uncertainty, and loss, transforming what should have been a source of hope into another site of vulnerability. Within the system of slavery, giving birth did not grant status, safety, or recognition. Instead, it bound women more tightly to a structure that claimed ownership not only over their labor, but over the lives they brought into the world. From the moment pregnancy became visible, an enslaved woman's body was no longer hers in any sense. Her condition was measured not by concern for her well-being, but by calculations of productivity and value. She was expected to continue working, often until the final days before childbirth, and to return to her duties shortly afterward. Rest was a privilege rarely afforded, and care was minimal. The physical toll of this expectation was immense, contributing to complications during birth and tragically high infant mortality. Loss became a familiar companion, woven into the rhythm of daily life. The trauma of enslaved motherhood extended far beyond physical hardship. Every birth carried the knowledge that a child's future was uncertain from the start. Enslaved mothers lived with the constant possibility that their children could be sold, relocated, or taken away without warning. Family bonds existed at the mercy of ownership, and affection itself became a risk. To love deeply was to risk profound grief. Yet many mothers persisted, nurturing their children quietly, teaching them resilience in a world designed to deny it. Separation was not an unintended consequence of slavery. It was a method of control, removing children from their mother's weakened family ties and reinforced obedience. For enslaved women, this meant living with a form of grief that had no closure. There were no funerals for children sold away, no acknowledgement of loss, only absence. The psychological impact of such separations was enduring, shaping how women related to the world and to themselves. Survival often required emotional restraint, a careful balance between attachment and self-preservation. Forced reproduction further complicated this reality. Enslaved women were valued not only for their labor, but for their ability to bear children who would inherit enslaved status. This expectation reduced motherhood to function, stripping it of choice and agency. Pregnancy became another obligation rather than a personal decision, reinforcing the notion that an enslaved woman's body existed for the benefit of others. Within this framework, maternal identity was shaped by power rather than preference, and autonomy was consistently denied. These experiences did not remain confined to a single generation. The psychological and social consequences of enslaved motherhood rippled outward, influencing family structures, community bonds, and emotional expression long after slavery formally ended. The constant threat of loss taught strategies of endurance that were passed down through stories, silences, and behavior. Trauma became inherited, not through memory alone, but through the conditions that shaped identity and survival. When placed alongside earlier discussions of unchecked power and structural exploitation, enslaved motherhood reveals another dimension of the system's cruelty. It demonstrates how slavery reached into the most intimate aspects of life, transforming care into calculation and love into vulnerability. Understanding this aspect of history is essential, because it shows that the harm inflicted was not only physical or immediate. It reshaped how generations understood family, security, and self-worth. To recognize the realities of enslaved motherhood is to confront slavery not as a distant institution, but as a lived experience that altered the course of countless lives. It reminds us that the legacy of this system cannot be measured solely in economic terms. It must also be understood through the enduring impact on families, communities, and the inner worlds of those who were forced to endure the unimaginable while still finding ways to survive. As we reflect on the harrowing history of enslaved black women, it becomes painfully clear that the abuses they endured were not merely isolated acts of cruelty, but systemic mechanisms designed to control, exploit, and dehumanize them. From the moment they were torn from their homelands and forced onto slave ships, through the grueling labor on plantations and the constant threat of sexual violence in households, these women faced relentless oppression that sought to strip away their autonomy, dignity, and even their identities. The myths and stereotypes perpetuated by European colonists, portraying black women as naturally promiscuous, were weaponized to erase consent and normalize sexual exploitation, ensuring that the suffering of these women remained largely invisible to the wider society. Historical records, whether in the French Atlantic world or through cases such as Sally Hemings in the United States, reveal that sexual exploitation was not incidental but structurally embedded within the institution of slavery itself. Enslaved motherhood further compounded this trauma. Women were forced to reproduce under the gaze of their owners, their children treated as commodities to increase profit, while family bonds were routinely severed through sales and separations. The psychological and social toll of such enforced reproductive labor reverberated across generations, shaping the lived experiences of black families long after emancipation. The scars of these injustices were further deepened during the Jim Crow era, when systemic segregation, discriminatory laws, and social prejudices continued to limit reproductive rights, access to healthcare, and opportunities for autonomy, creating lasting disparities that persist to this day. Even now, the legacy of slavery continues to affect black women, manifesting in racialized stereotypes, hypersexualization, inequitable healthcare, and social marginalization. Understanding this history is crucial, not only to honor the resilience and humanity of those who suffered, but also to confront the structural inequalities that endure in modern society. By acknowledging the full scope of this past, from forced labor and sexual exploitation to the destruction of families, we can begin to dismantle the narratives and systems that allowed such abuses to persist and to work toward a future rooted in justice, equity, and recognition of black women's dignity and rights. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this difficult yet essential history. Your attention and reflection help ensure that the voices of those who endured unimaginable suffering are not forgotten. If you found this story meaningful and eye-opening, please support our work by leaving a like, sharing this video with your friends and family, and subscribing to our channel. Your encouragement allows us to continue creating content that sheds light on untold narratives, highlights historical truths, and inspires awareness and action. Every view, every click, and every subscription contributes to keeping these crucial stories alive and honoring the memory of those whose lives and struggles helped shape the world we live in today.